Hello and welcome to this Clinical Care Options Oncology podcast. I'm your host, Jerfis Constanzo. In today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Jessica Lin from the Massachusetts General Hospital and Dr. Alice Shaw from the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, Massachusetts. Together, they will be discussing the available clinical data and first-line treatment options for ROS1-altered advanced non-small cell lung cancer. This episode is part of a larger educational program entitled ROS1 Revealed, a cancer conversation on the changing tide of non-small cell lung cancer treatment. For more information on Drs. Lin and Shaw, along with a link to the complete program including downloadable slide sets and a clinical thought commentary, please visit the show notes for this episode. Now, let's hear what the experts have to say on this topic.
Now let's go ahead and review the available clinical data for the treatment of ROS1 fusion-positive non-small cell lung cancer. Now that you've heard a lot about the underlying biology and the best methods for diagnosing ROS1 fusion-positive lung cancer, we're going to shift gears and focus on the optimal management for patients with ROS1 fusion-positive non-small cell lung cancer. The current standard of care initial therapy for patients with advanced or metastatic ROS1 rearranged lung cancer is targeted therapy using a ROS1 inhibitor or ROS1 TKI. At this time, there are 3 ROS1 inhibitors that are FDA approved for this indication in the United States: crizotinib, entrectinib, and repotrectinib. We're going to review the key efficacy and safety data for each agent, starting with crizotinib. Crizotinib was the first ROS1 inhibitor to be developed and approved for patients with ROS1 fusion-positive lung cancer. This is a multi-kinase inhibitor that also has activity against other kinases like ALK and MET, and its activity in patients with ROS1 lung cancer was evaluated initially in the single-arm phase 1 study called Profile 1001. The baseline characteristics of patients who enrolled in the trial at that time largely consistent with the clinical pathologic characteristics of ROS1 lung cancer. And this was the first trial in ROS1 lung cancer to really demonstrate the kind of rapid, deep responses that can be induced using ROS1 targeted therapy in this patient population. The overall response rate with crizotinib was 72%, and the median duration of response in this study was 17.6 months. Here we are seeing the median progression-free survival that was achieved with crizotinib in this study of 19.2 months. Now, as there is emerging interest in trying to tease out whether the underlying particular ROS1 fusion variant impacts the outcomes of patients. In this phase 1 trial of crizotinib, there was no such signal detected, but again, this was assessing a very small number of patients, so that was an important limitation to bear in mind. Now, because crizotinib has been around for a while for ROS1 lung cancer, we do have long-term follow-up data available. The median overall survival for patients with ROS1 lung cancer treated with crizotinib is exceeding 4 years. Crizotinib is generally considered a well-tolerated ROS1 inhibitor. The most common adverse events that are observed with crizotinib, including visual impairment, gastrointestinal side effects, and edema. Dr. Shaw, I wanted to ask you a question here. You have treated many patients with crizotinib at this point. Would you say that these are consistent with what you've observed in the real-world setting? And are there any unique aspects that you would like to highlight, particularly with long-term use of crizotinib in those patients who are able to attain durable benefit?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jess. Really important points around the side effect profile of crizotinib. And I would say what you've summarized is what we've seen in terms of patients who have been on crizotinib. I would say the visual disturbance is extremely common. Almost all patients will experience that, but usually it's quite mild and seems to actually dissipate for most patients over time. I would say the main side effects that do seem to bother patients when they're on crizotinib can be the GI side effects, so nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and also an important one that you mentioned is edema. And this is one that is somewhat of a cumulative toxicity. It does seem to worsen over time. And so for those patients who stay on crizotinib for a year or a number of years, I think every one of them will have some degree, often quite significant edema. And then just the last side effect or toxicity that I'll mention is the potential for elevated liver function tests, so a transaminitis. This is not unique to crizotinib by any means, but just does require monitoring, especially when you are first starting a patient on crizotinib.
Great. Thank you so much for those insights. Now we're going to shift to the second ROS1 inhibitor that's been around for ROS1 lung cancer. This one is entrectinib. Entrectinib, like crizotinib, is considered a first-generation ROS1 inhibitor, but it is a distinct drug with key differences that set it apart from crizotinib. Number one difference is that while it also has multiple kinase targets, aside from ROS1, the key other target of entrectinib is TRK proteins, TRK-A, B, and C. And this will have a bearing on the unique toxicity profile of entrectinib that differs from what we see with crizotinib. The second key difference has to do with CNS penetration and activity, and we will get to that shortly. We're going to review today the data from the integrated analysis of 3 phase 1 and 2 clinical trials that evaluated entrectinib in adult patients with ROS1 lung cancer, starting with systemic efficacy. In this analysis, entrectinib demonstrated an overall response rate of 77%, median duration of response of 20 months, and median progression-free survival of 15.7 months. Here again, we do have long-term follow-up data available, indicating that the median overall survival of patients with ROS1 lung cancer who receive entrectinib is approximately 4 years. Importantly, as I alluded to, entrectinib does cross the blood-brain barrier, and it has shown activity against brain metastases in patients. So in this analysis, the intracranial overall response rate was 80% in patients who had measurable brain metastases, with an intracranial duration of response of 12.9 months. I mentioned the side effect profile of entrectinib is different from that seen with crizotinib. The most common adverse events with entrectinib include dysgeusia, dizziness, weight increase, and paresthesia. Now, these are actually related to the TRK inhibition effect of entrectinib. So these are on-target effects of the drug. And we'll return to these when we discuss the third ROS1 inhibitor that's FDA approved, which is Repotrectinib later on. In this analysis, there was a 34% frequency of treatment-related adverse events resulting in dose reduction in patients, and 5% treatment-related adverse event resulting in treatment discontinuation. Repotrectinib is a next-generation inhibitor of ROS1 and TRK proteins, and it was developed to be potent against diverse ROS1 and TRK fusions, as well as mutations that are known to cause resistance to the first-generation ROS1 inhibitors, crizotinib and entrectinib. So repotrectinib was evaluated in this phase 1/2 global registrational trial called TRIDENT-1, and the recommended phase 2 dose of repotrectinib was determined as 160 milligrams once a day for 2 weeks or 14 days, followed by up-titration to twice-daily dosing. And this dosing was determined based on the overall efficacy and safety data, as well as the pharmacokinetic data that were obtained from the TRIDENT-1 trial. Now, in the phase 2 portion of the trial, there were a number of different patient cohorts that were evaluated. And one of these was for patients who had ROS1 TKI naive, ROS1 fusion positive lung cancer. Focusing in on that cohort of patients with ROS1 TKI naive lung cancer, the confirmed response rate with repotrectinib was 79%, and specifically among those patients who had not received chemotherapy either previously, the response rate was 82%. The responses were durable with a median duration of response of 34 months. The median progression-free survival was 35.7 months among the TKI-naive patients. The overall survival data were immature. I want to pause here and ask you, Dr. Shah, what are your impressions and thoughts regarding the PFS data?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I think this PFS data with repotrectinib and this TKI naive cohort is really impressive. I mean, I think you already noted that with our first generation ROS1 TKIs, the PFS estimates were lower, right? With crizotinib, the median PFS that we saw in the phase 1 was about 19 months. With entrectinib, the median PFS was about 16 months. And so here to see, a near almost doubling of median PFS, I think is quite striking. And to me, it does suggest that more potent ROS1 inhibition, including inhibition of resistance mutations, such as the solvent front mutation, the G2032R, and I think also importantly, treatment and likely prevention of CNS metastasis, since it is a highly CNS penetrant drug, does likely translate into significantly longer responses and hence longer PFS.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Dr. Shah was referring to CNS activity of the ROS1 inhibitor. Repotrectinib indeed is a CNS penetrant TKI and has shown intracranial efficacy in this trial. The intracranial response rate among a fairly small number of patients in this trial with CNS metastasis that were measurable was 89%. And the 12-month intracranial duration of response here was 83%. And these are the overall safety data for repotrectinib from the TRIDENT-1 trial, showing that 38% of patients had adverse events requiring dose reduction, and 7% of patients had adverse events that required treatment discontinuation. The most common adverse events with repotrectinib included dizziness, dysgeusia, paresthesia. Again, these were all felt to be related to TRK inhibition. Dizziness is very common with repotrectinib. It is actually observed in over 60% of patients treated with repotrectinib. Dizziness usually occurs very early on treatment, within 1 to 2 weeks of starting therapy, and most are mild, grades 1 to 2. So given that we now have 3 FDA-approved ROS1 inhibitors to reach for as an initial treatment option, how do we choose amongst these options? There are both disease-specific and patient-specific factors, right, that have to inform the treatment selection. Alice, let me ask you, how do you approach the first-line treatment selection now with the 3 approved ROS1 inhibitors? What are the factors that you consider?
Yeah, Jess, this is a great question and very, very timely. I do like the slide that you put together here because I think it really does capture well the major factors that we should consider when we're selecting a ROS1 inhibitor for, a newly diagnosed patient with ROS1 positive lung cancer. And certainly the efficacy data, I think, are a major driver in my decision. I would say CNS efficacy in particular is also really important to consider in those patients who may have brain metastases at diagnosis. But I also think that in addition to efficacy, we do have to take into account the toxicities. You did a really nice job, I think, capturing the distinct toxicity profiles just with each of these ROS1 TKIs. They are somewhat distinct profiles. None of them are side effect free. And I would say that I do factor that in. So for example, if I have a patient who has newly diagnosed ROS1 positive lung cancer and they have baseline neuropathy and they may have difficulty walking, for example, that patient's probably going to struggle quite a bit with the dizziness and the ataxia that we see with repotrectinib and maybe less so with entrectinib. So I might, in that case, favor another ROS1 TKI that doesn't cause as much dizziness. And so, or perhaps refer that patient to a clinical trial of a newer ROS1 inhibitor that, again, does not have that same TRK inhibition and TRK-related side effects. There are other factors too, which you've noted here, which we don't really have time to go too much into, but these include also financial and access issues, I would say, especially in parts of the world where there isn't ready access to clinical trials or even necessarily ready access to what we consider here as standard of care targeted therapies.
Thank you, Dr. Lin and Dr. Shah, and thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us. As a reminder, to view the full program, ROS1 revealed a Cancer Conversation on the changing tide of non-small cell lung cancer treatment, and to download the slide sets associated with this discussion, please click on the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.